Thank you so much, Fabian. I'm really happy that I made it. As we promised, we could do something together. It's happening. It's great that things come to reality as well, as kind of having some kind of vision of what things can happen within this field. This is, is a nascent field. It's kind of disorganized, but has a lot of expression, and I don't want to claim the philosophy as some kind of special expression, but for me, the philosophical investigation of techne instrumentality is important to actually revisit the ground of what we take instrumentality to be, technology to be, and the kind of process by which human culture has created, invented, put to work technology, and the consequences of this kind of creation of technologies that we are increasingly living and embedded within. So aesthetically, we have consequences, politically we have consequences, and I guess the panel today, we came together to actually push forward not just an idea that, okay, we have now artificial intelligence, but that actually intelligence as a kind of expression of technology has been there from the very beginning of human culture, insofar as we were talking before, techne or instrument or machines have always been some kind of reflexive expression of human culture. But the reflexive expression of human culture has also been not just completely harmonized with human culture, but has almost pushed human culture to become more than it was. So a process of denaturalization, alienation from nature, and also a process by which intelligence becomes above all a social affair. So it's very important for us to rethink technology in terms of its sociality, its capacity to rewrite ontological ground, and also bring forward some kind of aesthetic and a political question. Another important question for us could be how to think critically technology in a period, in a kind of age where the means that we use for critique are the same means that governance use to govern human population. So there is this kind of apparent paradoxical state that we cannot get out. The only thing we can do is to create tactics of breakdown, of error, or refusal, or withdrawing. And that's a problematic that somehow gets us stuck on a superficial level. One provocation could be of this panel to how we actually think, not just to disrupt the system, the structure, but actually by acknowledging that models of artificial intelligence are no longer just structure, but also contain contingency, errors, variation, how then one can rethink not just to disrupt the structure, because the structure is already disrupted, that is already dynamic and flexible, but rather to restructure the structure through its own fallibility. So it's a kind of harder second level task rather than just using technology to reflect the system, but it's using technology to reform the system. So that's one of the tensions that perhaps we could discuss. That said, I have to stop talking because otherwise I take time from these amazing panelists today. I'm really very, very pleased to have this very heterogeneous but consistent, I guess, panel. We are going to start with Ramon Amaro. Ramon is, as you can see from his bio, is finishing his PhD at the Center for Cultural Studies with us. And the title of your talk is, because I wrote it on the computer, and the computer shut, so I don't remember. Machining culture and discrete abstraction. Thank you very much. So we have kind of almost 20 minutes. Yes, go there, and then I guess I will continue to the next presentation, unless there is some kind of urgent or some kind of intervention that the audience wants to do straight away. So I just give you 1 minute. If you have a response, otherwise we go ahead. Okay, thanks.
I just want to start by saying thank you to the conference organizers for having me today, and thank you to Luciana for that introduction. Over lunch, she mentioned some of the themes that we're hopefully going to address today and some of the conversations that we had over lunch, and it's interesting that part of that conversation was thinking through the capacity to respond. And I'll talk about what that means later, and not just thinking through modes of control as the mechanization of culture. And I say this because arguably the most persistent problem of philosophy and other forms of critical thought is that of the fundamental principles of contradiction and difference. To think through contradiction and difference is to think through that which is incompatible and apparently unrelated. The problem is one that philosophy has grappled with for some time now, and I argue is still the burden of critical theory, especially as we come to terms with the relation between humans and machines. The critical entry is not simply the position from which these two are compared, but more so a response to that relation as the object of inquiry itself. I want to show that problems in the reconciliation of contradiction and difference derive from a fundamental logics of the category, but not just the categorization of the discrete, whether they be human or machine. Instead, I question the rationale of relation itself towards the justification of an operational type process, one that clearly expresses itself in the interpretation of the approximate as a method of social organization and control. Clearly, in running with the themes of this event, I would like to draw on our intimacy with the artificial, or more so, our determined efforts to sort of reimagine this intimacy as something other than a frightening love affair. Nonetheless, I want to build upon a certain historicity of the foundations of the artificial to hopefully open new questions to the problems at hand. It is unlikely that the role of any type of self-liberation or actualization or even social equality in the interplay of contradiction and difference will reach any satisfying reconciliation in this space. The good news, however, is that hopefully a larger understanding will emerge to mitigate the tensions found in the dynamism of our everyday experience, movements, and mundane types of behaviors. To start here is to recognize that the modeling of an object's motion has been a topic of mathematics and philosophical thought for a long time. Since the 14th century mathematician Oresme first used the relation between time and distance to come up with a graphic representation of movement in the form of a straight line, the problem of the object has been one of measurement. In other words, to understand an object's place in this world is temporal spatial positionality. A calculus can be applied to determine the speed at which this object has moved any measurable distance. In fact, the basic function of the calculus is to characterize discrete quantities whose relation to one another may otherwise differ or vary. Specifically, it provides a point of focus on the relation between time and distance traveled, making it possible to determine a rate or velocity, a speed measured in terms of miles per hour, kilometers per hour, or meters or transactions per second. This means that a line, a trajectory, can be established to trace previous paths traveled, as well as depict a specific representation of where a discrete element might next arrive. In other words, if one wants to determine at the rate at which something changes, then all one needs is a section of that line established by the trajectory, divided by the distance traveled, or what could be thought of as its magnitude over the total time it took that object to get there. This means that the relation between point A and those of point B are no longer just a matter of circumstance or coincidence or apparent difference, even if they have come about this way. The calculus allows for both points to supersede their position as a discrete object in a certain space and time and enter into a connection in terms of their movement between one another. Therefore, point A and B are no longer simply phenomenons surrounded by circumstances of their existence, but emergent of an identity marked by specific changes in their calculated values over time. The difficulty here is that measurement in traditional calculus requires velocity to be constant, steady, and unchanged. Otherwise, the measure would only be an approximation, a best guess of where something has been and where it will likely end up. In addition, a multitude of discrete velocities would have to be determined in order for any comprehensive continuity to emerge. And we sort of saw that earlier in the videos we watched, this sort of continuity of discrete types of motion. This would require you and I to never shed a skin cell or increase speed in a bout of road rage. Our movement would need to be constant and unmitigated for any continuity to emerge. Although this formulaic view of life may seem intimidating, I assure you what I'm speaking of here are merely algebraic representations of geometric functions, or the subsumption of motion into mathematical symbols that can again be interpolated into visual representations. And although Leibniz, and arguably independent of Newton, developed an alternative to this type of traditional algebra, one that is able to account for the realities of continual rates of change, or the differential, it was Descartes' insight that brought us much closer to the continuity between what is real and any visual representation of real events. Descartes argued that a mathematical function can not only represent motion, but that representation could itself be abstracted into a visual graph. We also saw that earlier. And it gets better, because Descartes makes a huge assumption here. In Descartes' theory, he states that if a function can be represented by a graph, then alternatively, a graph can be represented by a function. And this is particularly important in the social sphere, because if that's the case, therefore we can dispense of the graphical altogether, leaving merely a function of a function, or in other words, a pure relationship between what we see as motion in real life and the mathematical representation of the same dynamic event. What remains then are not discrete objects that make up events or even the events themselves, but the basic functions of the event, the operations, as made up of smaller, even infinitesimally discrete objects. Your road rage is no longer a compilation of a bad mood and someone else's bad driving, but a symbolic motion, a function of behavior that carries you from point A to point B, represented by a function that simulates the trajectory of offensive events. This may not seem immediately important, but the functions at hand involve motion as well as difference, as there is no way to distinguish between the motivations or objectives of an object in motion and the ahistorical outcome. Perhaps the other driver, had a bad day. In other words, at stake already in the 14th century and carried on in the 18th century and onward and beyond is the calculus as a process of normative recommendation, independent yet explicitly reliant upon reality. Also at stake is the ease at which the moral and political economy maneuver between lines of mathematical logics, of which the other panelists will elaborate on later. For instance, consider the Prussian military general and strategist Karl von Clausewitz's rational calculus of war termination, where he argues that, quote, since war is not an act of senseless passion, but is controlled by its political object, the value of this object must determine the sacrifices to be made for it in magnitude and also in duration, thus the calculus. Once the expenditure of effort exceeds the value of the political object, the object must be renounced and peace must follow. What is particularly interesting about Clausewitz's theory is not so much his provocation of a moral means to war, but the scale at which war is carried out, not in strength or even violence, but the calculation of political will. For Clausewitz, war is no more than a larger magnitude of a duel, a one-to-one confrontation, where the immediate aim is to incapacitate an opponent in order to prevent any resistance. In other words, war is a direct confrontation between two discrete elements, the victor of which is the one able to use that relationship between their differences to invoke submission, compliance, and surrender. Clausewitz argues that countless duels go to make up war, but the operation of war itself is more than the magnitude of force of one aggregate against another of equal, lesser, or greater value. The calculation of war exceeds the relation between the immediacy of incapacitation and the magnitude of force required to do so. Instead, war is, as he writes, an act of force to compel our enemy to do our will. Here, force is a certain self-imposed, imperceptible limitation of the self to voluntarily submit to the other, sort of like an act of chi, as Isabel Stingers illustrates, as an energy that supersedes violence, instead gaining the upper hand through manipulation and enticement. As with chi, what Clausewitz has done is articulate a means of self-suppression. In this way, the enemy is no longer its own object or valid in its own objectives, but representative of a function of force and cue for political optimization. I don't have much time here, so I'm going to skip to how I consider this with the human brain. Now, I stay here to sort of consider the human brain, since what is the brain other than a cluster of electrical movements, an assemblage of discrete elements whose extraordinary activity is mostly hidden from view, at least to general understanding. More formally, the brain is a network of relations between individual neurons clustered in a field of interaction. They do not duel, but they communicate. These neurons have operational functions over the excitation or inhibition of electrical signals that flow between them. Sorry, I'm just going to skip through because we haven't much time. This particular problem of communication between neurons is what led cyberneticians Warren McCulloch and Walter Pitts to theorize that the brain is no more than a closed system of elementary components that behave as binaries and therefore are computational. They conceived of a neural net project using experimental epistemology to develop a science of the mind, a science based upon signals and binary logic that clearly defines units to represent perception and rules of dynamic transformation of mental states. The result in McCulloch-Pitt's notion of mind as signal-bearing neural nets reconstituted human cognition into modes of representation. They believe that neurons followed the rule of all or none. They either fire or they don't, 1-0, win or lose, and therefore any activity that ensues either from or through the brain, including that which perceives, judges, and creates, what we think of as the mind, can be thought of as a network of recognition. Now, this is around the same time that computers were emerging into a new science of communication and computational control, illustrated most famously in the Turing Church thesis, with a theory of information which was more than a race to technical agility, but the transformation of life and society into discrete components that could be measured, merged, and formed. The McCulloch-Pitts neural nets formed an important foundation in the field of cybernetics, computer science, AI, automata studies, robotics, and self-organizing systems. However, the novelty of McCulloch and Pitt's work is not merely in the notion that a mathematical model can be applied to psychological and mental phenomenon, but rather in the notion that the mind can be spread out or flattened into operational binaries. Presently, artificial neural networks stand at the helm of powerful and ubiquitous machine learning applications. And although what we presently know as artificial neural network is not aimed at simulating the activities of the brain anymore, they do constitute modes of machinic perception and the ability to collate and categorize and manipulate discrete elements of data into unified productions of knowledge. I go on to talk about basically the mechanisms in a neural network, which is the sigmoid function. There is an actual mathematical function which is meant to simulate the actual electrical transfer that would happen between neurons. And the fundamental basis, besides an artificial neural net, instead of the internal layers of that net, was particularly important is the sigmoid function. And this function can be manually adjusted to adjust the type of information transfer between nodes of a neural network. So we already see this sort of the manual, human-driven process to manipulate what is otherwise a natural free form of information. I'm going to go on to end up here because we don't have much time, and just say that although it could be argued that McCulloch and Pitts had no moral or political objectives in their program, it must be asked through what mechanisms the logics of discretization are or can be used to subsume individual difference or restrict the free movements of citizenship. I have attempted to illustrate, if haphazardly and very quickly, that we have been through, that what we have seen through McCulloch and Pitts, Newman's cellular automata, the Turing Church thesis, and countless others, is the continuation of a dialectic between the natural and the artificial, the discrete and collective, or the ordered and chaotic. And what remains are elementary referents in the formation of computational models. Within these regimes of abstraction and dynamic constriction, life is recast as that which can be collected, traced, and measured, an equivalence that has yet to reach its full potential in the livability and full mobility of self-will of the individual. Furthermore, what becomes of a social when the relation between discrete bodies of difference, even in the drama of the mundane, are no longer values of contradiction, but subjects of mathematical operations that can approximate, but not fully account for, the parallel activities of randomness and difference. Applications of the artificial must confront the social not as a problem of continuity, but that of its own tensions between the logics of discretization and the lived uncertainty of discrete movement, notwithstanding the spatial-temporal behaviors of discrete objects. Left, unfortunately, in this conundrum are more questions than answers in our current duel with the lived reality of the symbiosis between sentient and artificial. Thanks.
Thank you, Ramon. Is there any question from the audience? Any urgent question? No. Okay, we go ahead and then we'll pick up. I have questions, but I'll just make a note here. So our next speakers are the group RYBN and just MB, RYBN from Paris and from all over the world, actually. I had the pleasure to meet them today, and I will send their work as absolutely interesting, I would say, both technically and aesthetically, despite they claim to be technical amateur. The title of their project is Anti-Data Mining. Thank you. Yes. Do you want the mic?
Yes. Okay. So, thank you for the introduction. This morning, I think Andreas mentioned the fact that we call machine a system that we don't really fully understand. So maybe this is a starting point of our investigation, which is called anti-data mining, which investigates the cross-territories of economics and cybernetics. Anti-data mining questions the structure of financialized economy at the edge of global information networks and automatized processes of decision. It started as a series of cartography, of dynamic cartography, and slowly and slowly, during the process of the investigation, because we started like in 2006, so 10 years ago, we began to have a great interest into algorithms, trading algorithms, and automated processes of trading. Also, one point for us which is important is like why we interest into this trading system. I think this last decade, all the articles, or a lot of articles about artificial intelligence and algorithms, were taking finance as a field of exemplarity. You always hear about the dangers that machines replace humans, all these mythologies. So it's a dual mythology level. You have the first mythology of the financial world and the second mythology of this replacement by machines. And so a few words about this market ecology or machinic ecology. Here by ecology, I'm quoting an article from Eric Scott and Seder, which is called Abrupt Rise of New Machine Ecology Beyond Human Response Time. This article describes maybe the actual state of markets with a huge accuracy. The first thing we can note about markets today is we have this microsecond scale timing. So a microsecond is a millionth of a second. So that's why they call it beyond human response time. The second thing is also it's a black box environment or black box. Nobody knows exactly how the algorithms are working. If you know, it's because the algorithms are not working anymore. They are just obsolete and put away from the market. Another thing, and a lot of strange events happen, which are called flash crash. So everybody may have heard about the flash crash of 2010, which was like a break in the market, which happened for a few minutes, which was one of the most important crash of all times, and which was supposedly caused by algorithms. Well, we'll see further that it was not only algorithms, but a certain way to program them. So all this environment, all this context, technical context, for us was of high interest, and the best way to discover how it works and how to deal with it is maybe to try to program an algorithm. So that's where we come with this project called ADMA8, which is an artistic project, but which use trading algorithm as a main medium. So it was launched on the 31st of August 2011. This algorithm, so it was launched on the market, European market, US market, and Asiatic market during the Greek debt crisis in 2011 that you might remember, and also all this polemic about the notation agency. Like, okay, well, everybody remember. It is active since then. It is still active on the market. So just a few numbers. It has bought since the beginning around 300,000 different shares, and it has earned something like 2,000 euros. So you have the historic of the transactions, and on the very top of the website you have the actual data. So the portfolio, the money it goes. So we gave him like $10,000 to manage, and right now it has earned like something like 2,000 euros. Okay, it's fully automated. We never changed the program since the very beginning, only making very fast translation from server to server, because it has changed from different server. Well, now how it works. So it's a very slow frequency bot because we don't have the means to make like high frequency trading. Actually, it's very, very expensive. So we are restricted by our broker. So we have an intermediary towards the market. And so this is the algorithmic diagram. And it works based on a neural network. Actually, so we have tried to input a lot of historical data to the robot, and then every day he scans the market, and he tries to detect opportunities in order to survive in this very aggressive environment. Well, so this is it's a very simple. It's almost like a radical reenactment of the Malkiel experiment that I will explain afterwards. So we call this like a sophisticated random, actually. If I talk about Malkiel, it's because during the whole process of building this algorithm, we were collecting papers, articles, news about markets and algorithm, and we tried to create a collection, a taxonomy or a bestiaire of all the different algorithms, which leads to the second part of the project, which is called the algorithmic trading freak show, which is actually a collection of algorithms. So every paper we can find with some information about how they work, what are the kind of techniques which are used, and in order to break the machine, to break this like black box, and to it's really like a dissection or autopsy, maybe more an autopsy because they're not usually. And we also collect mainly algorithms which are responsible of crack, of failure in the market, of errors. Let's say it's our way to curate the selection. So we have around 30 different algorithms. By algorithm, we have also a very, because it's also, yes, I know, 5 minutes. It's a very wide acceptation word. So we take for algorithm every kind of process that you can redo and which is like a strict. That includes Malkiel experiment. I'll be very quick about the experiment. Malkiel, in his book Random Walk Down Wall Street, proposed that the portfolio of a trader would be selected by monkeys throwing darts on a newspaper, saying like, and I quote, a blindfolded chimpanzee throwing darts at the Wall Street Journal can select a portfolio that performs as well as those managed by the experts. And this experiment for us is fundamental because it's also a moment where Wall Street and the finance industry stopped with the information, not the information as a cybernetic information, but the information-based trading, which was a bit esoteric and is something we can discuss. But and then they changed totally from information to signal treatment. So basically, they don't care about the external world. It is only noise in the mind of the people who program the algorithm. And what is interesting is only signal. One of the first adaptations of the Malkiel experiment is the zero intelligence algorithm. Zero intelligence was programmed in 1993, or proposed in a program and proposed by two economists, God and Sander. And as the name explains everything, it has no intelligence. It just tries to shave the best profit out of random. This was made in the academic sphere, in the laboratory. Slowly and slowly, you have generation and generation of different algorithms, more sophisticated, that use the same basis. So it's a kind of a lineage of algorithm, like a generation, with several generations. So you have the zero intelligence plus, the AA, the GDX, the zero intelligence plus, etc., etc. So every time they try to put the different algorithms, they put them in a competition in a simulated market, which is very restricted, very limited, what they call a trading agent contest. And then they try to see if it can outperform a human, and then sometimes it is translated into the market. So this is one of the timeline. Maybe we'll see with Ami later on all this, the same kind of implementation using Twitter sentiment analysis, which come from the laboratories, the academic, and which cause crashes. It's something I won't develop right now, or maybe in the questions. Well, it is also important because you have to understand, like most of the models were developed into this kind of academic laboratories, simulated markets. Yes, and maybe the most well-known example is a model called Sniper, which was developed by Todd Kaplan during this academic contest. And it was the most performative strategy at the time. So the strategy is very simple. It waits, and it looks at the data of the other bot, and at the very end of the day, it goes to steal the deal. So that's why it's called sniper. And this strategy was so popular, it was implemented in all the algorithms. But you have like a kind of black swanish consequence. And this consequence is if all the algorithms are working together, then the market is paralyzed, is frozen. Okay, so this leads maybe to the small conclusion. And here I will borrow the concept of Michel Thibon-Cornillo, Planet Laboratoire, which is also like transfer from the idea of theory, and when it goes into practice, technologies or techniques can drag black swan or unpredictable consequences. And I think the market, with all the different examples, flash crash and all the other, are the perfect example of this. So yes, I just wanted to finish with Michel. Voilà.
I don't know if you heard maybe I'll say the title again because it's quite long. So it's Formalizing Analogical Transitions within a Multi-Level Dynamic Mechanistic Framework. And so I'm going to have to explain the title for the first half of the talk because it's quite long. So firstly, what's a dynamic mechanistic framework? Simply put, it's the way in which we can understand the properties of a system by disassembling it and seeing how its parts work, either individually or in combination with other parts. So it's a mechanistic framework because it acknowledges that the concept of mechanism has been and still is a key idea of modern science, by which the characteristics of a system are explained according to the causal structure of its parts. And that's something that came up in the question session here with Andreas earlier. So it's like the positive idea of a mechanism in some way. So though the classical mechanistic framework has been kind of critically overcome by the recognition of the ubiquity of nonlinearity in dynamic systems theory, the concept of mechanism as structure-based explanatory framework for the functioning of a system may be retained if it is suitably dynamicized. The mechanistic framework is multi-level and dynamic because it is neither ruthlessly reductionist nor rabidly anti-reductionist. It recognizes that the functional characteristics of a system at one level of analysis may be emergent properties that are not well described by the lower level dynamics that support them, without claiming that these properties are irreducible to the behavior of its structural components. So this is called weak as opposed to strong emergence. So the framework itself is dynamic. The framework itself is dynamic since it progresses by several stages of decomposition and localization of functional properties in structural components. If a property cannot be directly localized in a structural component, then it may be hypothesized as a property of the interaction between two or more components, and if this hypothesis fails to hold, a further level of complexity can be adduced up to the point where a property can be assumed to emerge at the global level of the whole system. So another important consideration that necessitates a multi-level analysis is that not only is order dependent on structure, but randomness and unpredictability are relative to the theoretical framework or computational setup. So, architecture, processing power, input stream, for example. So a system or an input is unpredictable only in relation to the theoretical framework that imposes its form of prediction. To understand something means to impute to it some kind of characteristic behavior under certain circumstances, and this entails prediction, abstraction, generalization. If we want to act on the world, we cannot renounce prediction or abstraction, and we cannot thereby avoid the possibility of some kind of random perturbation to our system. However, we may construct systems that are more or less robust or resilient to perturbations, more or less capable of the dynamic revision and reconstruction of theoretical frameworks. Crucially, different theoretical frameworks are necessary for each level of analysis, even though these can be reintegrated in a multi-level. And the dynamics of randomness, unpredictability, and robustness or resilience to perturbation are distinct at each level. So, for example, physics, biology, and social systems may be distinguished along precisely these lines, as well as being distinguished from computational systems, and then computational systems, so then we can classify the descriptive capabilities of different computational systems along a computational hierarchy, ranging from finite automata to universal Turing machines. Again, this is to do with their capacity to describe different levels of randomness or unpredictability. So, moreover, the multi-level dynamic mechanistic framework provides an engineering perspective by which the functional property of intelligence itself is decomposed, and the resulting explanatory hypotheses enable traction not only on the problem of engineering artificially intelligent agents, but also on re-engineering the human. Okay, so why formalization now? Formalization may be understood as the explicitation of implicit theoretical frameworks or models. And making these models explicit allows for them to be analyzed and transformed. Implicit rule-governed practices will always be in excess of any explicit formalization of them. This was amply demonstrated by the later Wittgenstein's investigation of language games. However, formalization may act as a point of leverage, giving externalized traction on the ideological sedimentation of implicitly structured practices. And this is a point well made by Joshua Epstein with regard to the efficacy and politics of computational modeling, which I'll come back to later in a kind of concrete example. So in this sense, formalization may be understood as a kind of decomposition of the implicit structure of a theoretical framework, allowing us to grasp its functional characteristics and change it. Moreover, formalization of a model makes possible its implementation in another substrate, such as an artificially intelligent agent. Okay, so another term in the title, why do we talk about analogy here? Firstly, we can consider the functionalist analogy, which understood the brain as a computer, as the initial stage in a dynamic process of decomposition and localization of the functional properties of cognition. So this is a process that moves from the first wave functionalism of Putnam, etc., based on symbol manipulation, to the dynamic model of neo-functionalism based on connectionism put forward by the likes of Bechtel and Wimsatt. So already with Turing, it was recognized that if the brain, in a very general sense, is something like a computer, it can be specifically differentiated from the kind of computational processes occurring on a discrete state machine at the lower level of the computational hierarchy, since while the latter is functionally context-free and iterates without variation, the former is context-sensitive, or further, as Turing had it, prone to exponential drift, which we may understand in today's parlance as sensitive to initial conditions, or nonlinear in its functioning. So this breakdown in the analogy does not definitively destroy its usefulness. In fact, an analogy that directly maps is hardly fruitful. The usefulness of analogies depends on whether any testable consequences can be deduced from them. In this case, the analogy has drawn out the difference between computational processes occurring in discrete state machines and those occurring in biological brains. In fact, modeling itself may be understood at the most general level as an analogical process based on abstraction that ignores certain details whilst highlighting how other features overlap. Secondly, analogical transitions between different contexts are not just a natural aspect of human intelligence, but a key cognitive operation of any intelligent agent, along with induction, recursion, and the management of behaviour through the apprehension of contextual frames, discursive markers, and conceptual contents. These are all different key aspects of cognition. As Arzi Gonksiarowski notes, this is the paper I'm kind of drawing on, she notes that, or he notes that Kant understood that analogy isn't based on an imperfect similarity of two things, but a perfect similarity of relations between two quite dissimilar things. And moreover, he understood these kind of supramodal transits in terms of categories. So it's extracting these perfect similarities that underlies the flexibility and generativity of higher intelligence, whether carbon-based, silicon-based, or hybrid. So Gentner, for instance, also models the use of analogy in various sub-processes of learning and reasoning, such as memory retrieval, mapping and structural alignment between different perceptions or environmental contexts, as well as evaluation, abstraction, re-representation, and adaptation. These are all, we can understand these all functioning through kind of analogical transitions. So analogy is key to the development of AI for the same reason that it underlies human reasoning. Furthermore, in interacting with human agents, artificially intelligent systems will need to analogize in order to respond to human behavior. Already, shit. Okay. At the very general level, we can distinguish two broad forms of analogical transition. One based on recognition of already given similarities through a diagnostic process of interpretive analysis, and another that is capable of creatively discovering or inventing new analogical transitions through a generative process of synthesis. In order to understand the centrality of analogical transitions to the general problem of intelligence, it's necessary to acknowledge the way in which cognition is embodied, embedded, enacted, and extended, the 4 E's. It's impossible to separate perception, conception, or action from the environment that supports it and to which it is directed. The fact that interaction with an environment plays an essential role in intelligence was recognized in Turing's early writings and developed more recently by others such as Clarke and Hutchins. So the latter, Hutchins proposes the concept of a cognitive supra-individual, including both the environment and the intelligent agent acting within it, which can be fruitfully aligned with the insights of second-order cybernetics. So this generatively extensible supra-individual context sensitivity can be applied not only to the intelligent agent, but also to its perceptions, conceptions, and actions, which can take on an infinite number of different senses, since there's no limit on the number of contexts in which their meaning is transformed. However, this relativity, plasticity, and genericity should not collapse into absolute relativity or sweeping skepticism regarding epistemic limitations, since some critical invariable aspect of meaning is held by individual perceptions, conceptions, or actions, and this must be shared across contexts in order for analogical transitions to make sense. So grasping this invariance may present problems in natural language due to the tendency towards an infinite regress of definitions, each of which will have context-sensitive connotations as well as invariance. So this is the problem with the excess of practical reason to formalization. However, contemporary mathematics has fortunately enabled a different approach. So category theory allows for gives formal tools, which are morphisms, to describe structure-preserving paths, that's invariance, between different perceptions, or conceptions or actions within a single interpretive context, or dually for a single perception, conception, or action across different interpretive contexts. So when an analogy is modeled by a morphism, then the monotonicity of that morphism captures the invariant core or uniformity of the analogy, while the non-monoticity provides a detailed description about the points where the analogy breaks down. Such breakdowns or slippages in the analogical transition do not invalidate it, but rather require the acknowledgement of non-monotonic variability and the construction of non-rigid abstract schemas that generalize over these differences, avoiding determination only where necessary. My time is up. Okay, okay, well, I was going to give a concrete example about this, which was, okay, maybe I can talk about it afterwards, but okay, so, then I'll finish here.
Okay, so thank you everybody for inviting me. I'm just going to get on with it. So, yes, and especially which is such a great title as Cold Bodies, Warm Machines. I'm going to talk about a few artworks teasing out questions of an evolving subjectivity in relation to the machine assemblages we increasingly find ourselves within, specifically focusing on the financial markets as a way of thinking through some of the more extreme operations of algorithmic control and probability theory, and the new behaviours that are made visible and produced through their governance. I'll end by talking about a recent work of my writing as a direct copy, Chapter 4 of Ayash's influential book, The Blank Swan, The End of Probability, to think through the contingency of writing as equivalent to pricing in the market, and how George Louis Borges' story of Pierre Menard, author of The Quixote, central to Ayash's philosophy, differs from previous ideas of copying and appropriation to repeat the contingency of the text. Let's start with Low Animal Spirits, which is a work that employs a high-frequency trading algo dealing in world news that took its cue from the oft-mentioned loss of the referent in both language and the economy, speculated about wildly after the economic collapse of 2007-2008. The HFT algo was written by Richard Cochrane, a former vice president of Goldman Sachs, and deals in words sourced from global news feeds for virtual profit while speculating on their usage. And it allowed a glimpse into the algorithm's buying and selling activity with volatility at the centre of this. The visualization you see here shows what's about to trend, while speculative headlines are generated with the help of a natural language processing algorithm tweeting from @LowAnimalSpirits every 2 minutes. And this is actually tweeting from Dundee at the moment. It's actually in an exhibition in Dundee, which I didn't realise was going to happen. The work produced some unexpected results when, during periods of low activity, the algo basically gets bored and sells off most of its portfolio, and then buys up lots of new small items as a kind of sifting process. And you can see this behaviour change when all the words appear to swarm. So, this kind of activity. And of course, this is only produced through the representation that we chose and is, appears to be an emergent behaviour, but isn't. The focus on news was interesting to us as a social production that's necessarily interwoven with a history of technological innovation that has an inherent need for language to actually be tethered to fact. And there's our brief diagram, which I'm going to keep going on actually. Breaking news flash crash shown here with the Associated Press Twitter hack tweet of 2013 that brought about a 1% drop in the market in a minute, generated further investigation into high-speed algorithmic procedures that seemingly conjoined language and the economy. And it's worth noting, maybe I'll go back to the diagram there, that high-frequency trading programs typically trade in small orders with small increments of profit to be made from each trade, creating a flow. Arnoldi writes of individually small, but thanks to the high frequency, collectively significant profits, often with little risk-taking involved. All of these trades rely on information gleaned from the raw data feed, as well as automated analysis of social media. And this takes us back to the flash crash. In a 2015 analysis of the flash crash, Tero Karppi and Kate Crawford draw attention to the data miner software that mines Twitter's firehose and delivers what's deemed relevant into the hands of traders. And as this software increasingly replaces human expertise, there's an implicit acknowledgement of the centrality of social productions being enmeshed within the very fabric of finance. Their analysis underscores the connectedness of the relation between systems of communication and monetary value, systems of humans and algorithms, which are now tightly bound within micro-relational forces of imitative encounters, drawing thick lines of connection that run between social media spaces, intermediate human and algorithmic actors, and financial markets. The scientific report on the abrupt rise of new machine ecology beyond human response time, which I think was mentioned earlier actually, by Johnson, Zhao, Hunzada, Key, Johnson, Meng and Tivnan, has begun to explore the behavioural changes that happen as society's techno-social systems are becoming ever faster and more computer-orientated, and far from simply generating faster versions of existing behaviour, show that this speed-up can generate a new behavioural regime as humans lose the ability to intervene in real time. So we can see this sort of differing scales and temporalities simultaneously weave through these operations with indistinct characteristics of human and non-human engagement, the complexities of which are highlighted when trying to prove intent rather than negligence when dealing with actor networks consisting of, on the human side, programmers, hardware designers, traders, risk managers, and on the non-human side, algos and hardware, although I would question quite those distinctions. As Jacob Arnoldi writes in his survey, Computer Algorithms, Market Manipulation and the Institutionalization of High-Frequency Trading, adding that if a trader operating or overseeing an algo used to place orders in a way that constitutes layering, they may not be the person who designed the algorithm. Indeed, the design of the algo might have been a joint collaboration between different people from different firms. And this was quite interesting when we were talking about the environment yesterday, or environmental sort of ways of thinking. Keynes' phrase, low animal spirits, captures the paradox that locates a herd-like mentality whilst being reliant on the unpredictability and uncertainty of the individual at the core of international finance as a model of mass behavioural procedures. And of course, the arena in which these ideas arose is of a time where the very concept of free will came into being during the Enlightenment, and as then Catherine Hales notes, an evolving subjectivity that emerged through market relations. Gambling and games of chance, with all the romantic heroism of the autonomous subject pitted against mathematical determinism, drove the quest for ever better odds, whilst the 18th century study of celestial mechanics developed complex new mathematical tools for deriving probable outcomes. And so the fantasy of this sort of sovereign subject melts into the continuous open topologies of Deleuze's control society, with the full financialization of the subject through a steady flow of statistics. And I was recently reading Dana, Luciana, and Mel E. Chen writing in Has the Queer Ever Been Human in 2015, where they point out that this subject is constructed as rational, bounded, integral, sovereign, and self-aware, to which the agency of rights and citizenship are granted. This is the default figure that grounds and personifies norms of behaviour, ability, and health. This is the figure around which we ordinarily construct notions of political and social agency. And I found the critique helpful in pointing to particular forms of dissatisfaction with the way things are, emerging from feminism, critical race studies, no, really, disability studies and elsewhere as a way to understand the tension between a need to universalise, while stay particular to the problem and forge connections between these divergent histories and how to think on more than one scale is the point. So on one scale, I'm drawn to work with these extreme operations that occur at microtemporal levels, at the level perhaps of these flows, effects, and forces. And when I first began to talk to Eli, I was intrigued by his attempts to deal with what he describes as the immanence that the market represents. And I'm just going to skip on to that. So I was interested in how he described that if no conceptual tool is available to stage the possibilities open to history, maybe a non-conceptual tool or medium can avail itself to us in order that we do something about history. Not that we would predict it, for it is now too late and the historic event has occurred, but maybe we could write it or trade it. And he's sort of claiming that writing can be seen to have an equivalence to pricing in the derivatives market. Markedly different to HFT, a derivative is a form of contract that derives its value from the performance of an underlying entity, such as an asset, and due to its being a form of contract, implicitly relies on writing. So the claim is that in writing, there is something that exceeds possibility and metaphysics, and there is, in trading in the market, something that exceeds the dilemma of either having to predict the content of history, which is impossible, or to replicate history and back trade it, which is empty. And this relies on the trader's writing of the text, because one writes when one forgets, and notably not to forget, which brings about an excess and the surprise gift of the text to the writer as a place outside of possibility, which Ayash names as the trading room, as a place of excess or a capacity and a room that involves risk. His writing wants to suggest that possibility is overwhelmed or overtaken by capacity, the writing trading capacity of changing the context when couched in the market and the price process, bringing about contingency as the instantaneous and differential definition of history, as opposed to integral, the generator of history, so to speak. And the Pierre Menard story, which is central to the way that he thinks through this, relies on this fictional character who writes the 9th and 38th chapters of the first part of the Don Quixote by Miguel de Cervantes, and a fragment of chapter 22. Borges writes, the chapters are the same, every word and every comma, as those written originally by Cervantes. Yet this wasn't a mechanical transcription of the original. He did not propose to copy it. And interpretations of this story tend to focus on how the reading of the text could never be the same when read in the 20th century, reliant on the reader to bring about difference. Eli's focus, interpolating the fiction with the apparatus of the derivatives markets, brings a different emphasis, focusing on the act of writing itself of a previously existing text, which he likens to the market as a truly contingent act, in that there is simply nothing that says that any given word will necessarily follow the previous word. I'm going to jump over error correction because I'm going to do a reading for you later. I think it's kind of, I'm going to skip on to this idea of writing of this previously existing text not only implies a radical unoriginality, but necessarily implies a different emphasis on repetition than previous strategies of appropriation or copying. And of course, Elaine Sturtevant is an artist that has been doing precisely that since the 70s. And was and is significant to this particular story in that she also produced Elaine Sturtevant, author of The Quixote, in 2009. And Sturtevant was always clear that her works weren't copies, but works of other works. And through operating within seemingly similar frameworks, her concept of replication also differs subtly to that depicted in Borges' story of Pierre Menard, which relies entirely on the exactitude of the copy. In the lecture Shifting Mental Structures in 2004, Sturtevant claimed the brutal truth of the work is that it is not a copy, and most importantly, that the dynamics of the work is that it throws out representation. And notably, her titles include the artist's name, whose work it is a work of, which should by rights avoid cries of plagiarism and forgery. Patricia Lee describes Sturtevant's work significantly as pushing the codification of artists to specific signifiers in relation to the structures and systems of art within which these signs act. And this, of course, implies that Sturtevant's works rely on their identification as significant works by well-known artists, reducing the artist's work to a sign, a brand, an easy meme producer, percolating myths of genius, and so on, that could be seen to have more to do with sales in the market than whatever other values might be claimed for art at any given time in history. Sturtevant's works invest in difference with all the evasive nimbleness of Deleuze in difference and repetition as a contrafactual repudiation of the hold she felt cybernetics to have on thought process. She contends with mutability, bluntly tracking changes, causing certain concepts of selfhood and aesthetics to be outmoded. Bruce Hanley writes, Sturtevant mobilises aesthetics to rally thought as power, whilst also being at the fore of new ways of working, saying to Hanley in 2003 in Art Forum, what is currently compelling is our pervasive cybernetic mode, which plunked copyright into mythology, makes origin a romantic notion, and pushes creativity outside the self. Remake, reuse, reassemble, recombine, that's the way to go. But for Ayash, there is no rewrite. Otherwise, there would be no risk in this enterprise. From the point of view of possibilities, for there is none facing Pierre Menard, as there was none facing my dim and dismal task as I wrote my writing in the market, except to write The Blank Swan, chapter 4, there is no possibility at all. Ayash expresses this by claiming writing as a capacity, not a possibility. The story of dynamic replication in Pierre Menard has only helped to separate the context from what exceeds it and helped us distinguish between possibility and contingency. And Ayesh would claim the distinction between possibility, context, and contingency is the capacity of changing the context of trading the text beyond its perfect replication. And I've got two sentences? No. Okay.
But we need to get...
Okay.
Please enjoy me. I think, I'm sorry I was too strict, but I want to give more time for discussion and also give some framework to the audience. It's been very patient to listen to these various levels of engagement with this question today. So I think we'll give more time to the panelists to explain what is that they are trying to discuss and put forward, what are their propositions. So I think that one thing that really came across interestingly, that if I may draw the line somehow, I would like to ask all the panelists to respond, is the question of the function. So what is this function of what is the function of intelligence? What is the function of error? What is the function of analogy? What is the function of writing? And obviously, you all, for instance, if I can go in order, and we start from Ramon's intervention, the question of what does the relationality, because you talked about the relation, for you start your paper with thinking about there is something about the contradiction and difference and relationality. Relationality needs to be re-looked at in this kind of contradiction. So what does the relationality of the function mean to you? Because you talked about the function of a function. That there's this kind of equivalence between a mathematical model and social behavior. And we all know that artificial intelligence really started with this kind of, not with an idea that there is intelligence within us, but intelligence is about behavior, conducts, and is externally, environmentally determined. And then I would like to get then Inigo to actually respond or add or complement or not this kind of idea of the function of analogy that you're saying there's a level in which, and what struck me is that they say there is this and very difficult to pronounce surname of this author that you are using, rereading of Kant, whereby there is something like an analogy that brings together a function of very diverse forms of intelligence. So both of you were addressing this question of relationality of human machine or intelligence, neural, and anyway, you know what I mean. So please.
Right. This okay? Is this on now? I mean, in a way, it's a very complicated question. I think that's why I gravitate in my research towards actually the genealogy of the mathematics themselves that make up. We sort of take for granted that the tools that we use, the machine learning, AI, neural networks, whatever have you, that these tools are actually functionally just a series of mathematical equations. We see them articulated in certain types of interfaces and certain types of consequences and operations themselves. And I think in terms of critique, we tend to overly focus on those actual mechanisms while the mechanisms of mathematics themselves become hidden. And why I think that's particularly important in relation to what you said, Luciana, is when you look at the foundation of mathematics itself, it's not implicitly concerned with symbolism or even representation. And I think that's the dichotomy when we look at artificial intelligence right now, where in terms of social critique, we're looking at symbolism or those types of things. But mathematics isn't no longer concerned about itself with symbolism, but is concerned with its actual own function. So in a way, it's self-reflective and it's always self-aware of its own function. And so the subsumption of anything into those functions actually feeds the function itself. I don't know if that makes sense. And that's why when I'm speaking of the actual equations themselves, really what I'm trying to highlight, especially in relation to Descartes and Leibniz and Kant, even so forth, going down the philosophical train, is a philosophical way to actually subsume difference, to actually eliminate the fact of variability and difference by just purely focusing on the function itself. In a way, it's a type of transcendence. So that's how I'm sort of seeing it.
So in a way, if I can go back to the Inigo, so can you respond, please, to in relation to what does this function of analogy say in relation to what is intelligence doing? Because you're talking about a kind of a mechanism of the doing of intelligence, and whether that kind of analogy that Ramon was talking about is what is it doing? So if there is this analogy, this model, this kind of want to think about this kind of a kind of continuity in the specificity of context, because that's the model, this continuity underneath, but there's also sensibility to context. Then what is this intelligence doing? What's the function of this intelligence?
Yeah, okay, well...
With an example, please.
Yeah, okay, well, first of all, I think we need to kind of distinguish between different kind of conceptions of function. So what Ramon was talking about was the mathematical function, which is about which Oresme kind of was the first to develop, which is about correlating two variables to give a kind of idea of intensive magnitude. It's a completely different idea from the kind of the idea of function which I was talking about, which was related to kind of how something works, and so the functional properties of systems, which I was opposing to the structural components. I mean, there's this kind of very interesting kind of gap between those things, right? So you can't, if for example, if you look at the kind of DNA, a structure of a DNA strand, you cannot, from looking at that structure, understand what functional properties will be expressed by that when it's evolved, or when it kind of through a process of embryogenesis. So kind of there's the point here will be that there's kind of functional properties are often, especially in complex systems, emergent properties that cannot be reduced to or predicted from looking at the traits of their components. But that doesn't mean that kind of they're then kind of like completely unexplainable. It just means that they're, the idea of weak emergence is that you would need to have a simulation of the whole system's properties, that's all of its behaviors, in order to understand what those functional properties are. Then the kind of idea of an analogy, was that part of the question as well? The idea of analogy, I was saying that analogy is basic to kind of to many different forms of reasoning, and it's necessary for kind of higher intelligence. And it's this kind of extracting of similarities between dissimilar things. So what Kant was criticizing was the idea of analogy as a kind of imperfect similarity between two things. And he switches it the other way around. He says, look, this is a perfect similarity between dissimilar things. You can really formalize this in very rigorous terms with using category theory, which gives you kind of structure-preserving transformations between kind of, so you find the invariance of a system by turning it round and by poking it, by changing it.
Okay, so so I guess this relation between the mathematical and this kind of more formal level that can then be applied to everything is not just translatable according to through physical, biological, technical system or cultural, aesthetic system. Is not about translation, but it's about finding a formalism that actually is able to articulate not just different, but articulate the context-specific unfolding or morphological complexity And so it just gives a very complex diagram, a geometrical model that I wonder whether you guys, when you talk about the function of error, whether the function of error within your system, when you are reflecting upon how these algorithmic structural geometries are actually based on a very open system, that they can not just can be reappropriated, but also work according to a very complex logic that you can reproduce, you transfer somewhere else, or you kind of use or reappropriate them from an aesthetic or political reflection. What does it afford politically, this kind of going within the formalism of the mathematical model of algorithms and transporting it on this, articulating on this political level? What does it allow you to do? What kind of critique, what kind of critical move allows you to do?
Critique of...
Yeah,
it just allows to critique the modern version of capitalism. It's as simple as that. Like it has transformed. It's a new version. Like it's a kind of I don't know. So it's if you don't understand the system, it's very difficult to criticize it. Actually, I would say the errors in our case is just the moment you can grasp. I don't know. It's more like it's a lead, so something is happening there. For example, we talk. Ami, I think you talk also about the flash crash. So if you detailed the function of the flash crash, it's not like a question of a robot towards robot. It's not a question of let's say like a new behavior. Actually, it's just people tricking the clock of the market. That's pretty much it. But to make this investigation, you need like to record all the data, to analyze all the data, to reproduce models, to investigate all the different actors. And there was, for the flash crash of 2010, there was like a lot of different versions. The first version was like someone pressed a button, then it was the Greek hackers. Then another version, it was this algo trader called Sarao, which was mostly a space god. But actually, if you work, you can by making like, let's say, data mining analysis, and that's where I join you when you say like we are using the same software, but we need to use them. We need to use them to understand what's happening. Because if you use data mining, you can correlate. Because there is too much data, you cannot process them like just by analysis. Like so, you need like to automatize it, and then you can see like at a certain moment, using certain frequency of orders, people were deliberately tricking the clocks, and that's what caused the flash crash.
In relation to what Amy is doing, sorry, just to train, because you're talking about writing as a form of scripting, as a form of, and you're still on one end that you're saying, yeah, that's the way, the mode of governability, but on the other hand, it's also an explorative mode. It's also a mode that is impossible to. It's not just a debunking exercise, by drawing on Eliyash, you're also talking about it's a contingency within the writing that allows for, if we want to stay on the level of the function of function, or the analogy actually allows for different modes. What does it afford for you aesthetically and politically as well? I think that you guys are working on different spectrum, although maybe within the same field. What would you say about that?
It's curious to me as to see, I guess, what kinds of subjectivity how are we inflected by this, and how is it possible to say exercise some perhaps modes of agency or what have you from a previous idea of the that we would maybe like to keep a hold of, we feel that we've lost in some way. What is it that's possible to do within these probability-driven sort of models. And of course, IASH would say that something like the Black-Scholes-Merton model is the market. This is real. This isn't a model. This is not model risk. This is risk. And this is acting within that market. There is nothing else, if you like. But the sort of inscribing which he focuses on is very much to do with the dynamic replication that the Black-Scholes-Merton model brings to the market, and then he starts to find equivalences with this previously existing text. And I was sort of surprised, actually, when reading this, at how much, say, somebody like Sturtevant's work actually sort of has an equivalence, but has been effectively sort of undermining the way in which, say, the ideas of the subject within the artist, the configuration of the artist, for some time, you know, but has. I'm wondering why this configuration hasn't fallen apart yet, almost, because it's not the sovereign subject which it so relies upon is completely undermined by Sturtevant's activities in the 60s.
Okay. I think at this point I'm going to open to the floor. We have around 10 minutes. There are obviously ways that you can respond to each other if there is, because obviously I feel that there is different kind of views and kind of vision about models of subjectivity or politics of resistance or invention vis-a-vis this kind of continuity between artificial neural nets, or this kind of underlying, one could argue, computational architecture of intelligence today. Is there any question coming from the ground? Anyone has a question, clarification? No? You do? No? Yes?
Thanks. You were talking about the functionality of information and of artificial intelligence, or about the function feeding function. But there, I actually didn't found any function on all of these theories, because these theories were so theoretical that it was we can talk only in the measure of art about all these theories, but I don't see any practical use of all of it.
I think it's interesting. I mean, most of the time when I do talk about mathematics, I actually show them because, you know, who knows maths and the functions. But I think it's an important question when you're talking about the practical application, and I think that's why I lodge right in that particular sort of space. When I say that actually difference can be canceled out, I mean that literally. Like, it can be crossed out of the equation. And that difference symbolically represents mathematically, it represents cultural contingency, difference, all the sort of categories that we're used to, enacting certain violences that we know in culture in terms of racisms, gender violences, sexism, things like that. So ultimately the project of my research is a direct confrontation to the engineering space, the designers of the algorithms themselves. Not to take for granted that actually the function of the function is implicit in their design of the algorithm itself. And so while it's implicitly philosophical, that's actually the main point of it, is when we consider the practical engineering space is taken for granted that the mathematics that are used to enact neural networks are based on philosophical principles. They didn't just sort of appear. I mean, that's one of the sort of the hidden realizations of a scientific formalist type of thought, is that these things are naturally appearing in culture, and it's not necessarily the case. They've been extrapolated based on observable epistemological observations of nature that has been taken and placed into a symbolic language that we know as mathematics, and that's turned into a function that's then fed back to us in the form of something sort of like an algorithm. So that would be, you know, from my perspective, that would be the direct intervention there. Do you develop a new type of mathematics? I'm not quite sure. Or a new type of algorithm or new type of space, we're not quite sure. I mean, there are emerging engineering spaces where they're really tackling the idea of how to deal with cultural discrimination, making use of the mathematics themselves. Like, how do you actually quantify an experience that we all feel on a different level, so on and so forth. So there is work going on in that area, but in a way, it's almost as Inigo is saying, in order to even address that work, we have to sort of understand how it actually functions within the entire process.
Yeah, sorry about the abstract theoretical level of what we're talking about, but then I wanted to finish with a concrete example about what I was talking about, and that was, there's a team of people working at Google, a small team, and they designed a neural net that fed the Google News as its kind of input source, and they wanted to so in order to kind of do some kind of language learning program and effectively, kind of how the neural net was working was by kind of representing the relationships between words by vectors in a vector space, right? And so, kind of, it was trawling through Google News feeds and finding kind of relations between words. So it get things like kind of, you know, Paris is to France as Tokyo is to Japan, right? Which is an analogy, right? An analogical relationship, which kind of gives you the concept of capital city, say, right? But then kind of the problem was, you know, that if you effectively the resulting the neural net kind of learnt or kind of picked up the kind of latent sexism that was inherent in the database, right? So kind of if you asked it, for example, man is to computer programmer as woman is to, it would say homemaker. And so on, right? So it was, and that wasn't kind of evident from any kind of one of the kind of the news pieces, which was like obviously kind of, you know, there was journalists and editors who were thinking about kind of, you know, whether what they were writing was sexist or not. But over the whole of the database, you got this kind of latent sexism, right? And that was kind of picked up by the algorithm because it was trawling the whole thing, right? And because you're using these kind of mathematical formalisms to represent that in vector space, you could see that vector space as a kind of a warping of the vector space, and then you could kind of what they did was apply a kind of the opposite procedure. So they kind of de-warped the vector space by applying the opposite warp, right? But one of the problems was that it was, you know, finding kind of, you know, what if you're looking at kind of any of those relationships, or, you know, in the warped vector space, you know, what was the appropriacy of any of those analogical transitions? You know, in order to do that, you'd need some kind of, you know, some kind of artificial general intelligence that would have some kind of normative capacity for kind of understanding the appropriateness of those analogical transitions. So they had to kind of effectively, you know, give that they ask Amazon's Mechanical Turks to whether or not those were appropriate. And of course, you know, Amazon's Mechanical Turks are also kind of a gender-biased workforce, so it's a kind of ironic thing there. But then, you know, the point would be still that kind of once you apply a kind of mathematical formalism to something, then you can kind of often see something that's there that was not so visible before, and then you can transform it.
Hello, thank you all for your talks. Whenever I hear people from England or London talking here about the recent changes like in technology and art and so on, I realize that you come from a totally different perspective because the English society is far more transformed already, yeah? So it's about the neoliberalism, the political system, it's the digital. I've got the feeling that the whole digital thing is accelerated a bit more over there. And so for me it's really interesting, as it's a little bit like, when I listen to this, it's like listening into the theory about the future which is still to come, in that radicality as it is already happening in England, especially about the political system and what's happening in art. So my question is now here, whether you are first, how do you see yourself or your theoretical approach in connection to the society and to the cultural political dimension you are living in England? This is my first question. And the second question is that I'm wondering whether you reflect yourself about the limitations of your own thinking within the time you live in, and which are the weak and strong points of your own theoretical reflection and research in connection to the idea, if you would look at it. Sorry?
It's fine. Sorry, we don't have much time.
No, but I need to say the last half of my sentence because it's really important. It's the question of how you can reflect your own point of view and research. Sorry, now I'm a little research. If you would think about yourself being 10 years ahead and look back at who you are and what you think now in relation to what you can expect, which changes to come. You don't have to answer it all. Did you get what I was trying to say? Okay.
I'll answer a tiny bit. Yes. I just feel a huge urgency to sort of address certainly the way in which social media and the interconnectedness of various different... Okay. We've got a problem because we've got little time, but I think there's a pressing urgency to actually sort of really scrutinise the connections between social media productions and the sort of effective register in which they tend to be received upon, but also the production that happens as a result of that. We've just experienced Brexit, and there is also Trump sort of in the horror zone. So there's a real pressing concern to actually sort of investigate this properly and really look at it and scrutinise it and try and work out what is actually happening.
Do you want to say something?
I think thank you for that question, because it's a constantly reflective sort of mechanism, but it's actually very nuanced on different levels. In one sense, an immediate response to that would say that we're the temporality that we think we're in with these mechanisms are not the same temporality as those mechanisms, because there's already neural nets running right here. For 10 years. You're already familiar with it, whether we want to critically assess it or not, because these mechanisms are at this point sort of self-running. The cultural acceptance and critique of that is a different type of temporality, which I aggress. But we also, even within the cultural mechanisms, we must recognize that majority of our critiques are Western type of critiques. And majority of the disadvantages, especially when I go into my research, come from a non-Western perspective. And so, but even within that, I really don't have time to even address even the temporalities and the positionalities which would go there. But I just want to thank you. I think that's a very important question that is constantly on the forefront. The reason why, myself included, the reason why I'm in that particular space is because, as Luciana said really quickly, is it's a very small space. The technological innovations that's making use of these tools far outweigh the actual critique of those tools. And so you see very few scholars or even practitioners who are trying to catch up and trying to critique those mechanisms before they're enabled to do maybe any other social harm that's possible. So that's all I can say now.
Yeah, I think critique can only be retroductive. So things have already happened, and in a way it's about not just catching up, but also following the temporality of not just gadgetry, because it's not just about looking at the last technology, but it's also thinking how these phenomena, these technological phenomena, are a way to really question the beginning. So it's always a going back in order to going forward. It's not just about being illuminary and looking into the future as some kind of possibility or utopia. On the other hand, though, what is really important is to take hold of the future in order to invent the future. That's also a political position, I guess, that we share. There's been a lot of talk about no future and end of critique, and actually to try and take the challenge of investigate these complex languages that are mathematical, philosophical, artistic, and technical is one a collaborative effort. So you're always required to take stuff from other people, even if you're not an expert. And on the other hand, is also to reformat, to reformalize, not leave knowledge in the hands of science, a scientific expert or philosophical expert or so on. So it's a big challenge to reclaim the future as well. You want to say something else? No, I think on this note of reclaiming the future, we can go. The panel, thank you very much.